Hello, my name is Rick Larrick. I'm a professor of management at the Fuqua School of Business. Thank you for joining today. Today's talk will be part of a special series that Fuqua has launched on LinkedIn to share business insights around issues of fairness, justice, and race. And my topic today is going to be thinking about stereotypes in the workplace and ways to anticipate them and try to create practices that mitigate their impact. I want to just encourage you to know that every day through Thursday, there will be sessions at the same time, and I hope you'll join us again in the near future. So what I want to talk about is just helping to kind of define stereotypes and talk about research around them and maybe demystify them a bit. There's been about 70 years of research in the field of social psychology on stereotypes, and I think having some sense of the research and also just some of the concepts allows people to talk more clearly about the ideas and then also make better plans around them. So the first thing I want to say about the word stereotype is I know that the word itself tends to evoke these negative images, that somehow it sounds like inherently wrong and bad. And certainly the consequences of stereotypes can be that, depending on how we act on them. But I want to have us look at stereotypes somewhat differently, which is that it's a natural outcome of the human mind, such that every time we encounter a person, an object, a place, we have prior expectations. We have these categories that help us understand those things, and we can't turn that off. So I'll use some really mundane examples, but if I say the word car or smartphone, you immediately have images that come to mind. You, in fact, can't avoid having those images. And it's extremely useful. Cars generally have four wheels. They generally have a gas engine, but they might not always have those properties. Certainly the gas engine is not true anymore. And so it's the same thing with categories about people, which is it's just this rapid, quick set of associations that we have that can serve us well, but can also be too simple. And that's kind of the heart then of stereotyping research is what are the dangers of having images that are too simple? When we think about diversity in the workplaces, one of the important categories is demographics, and we'll return to themes around it. But there's lots of forms of diversity in organizations. And in fact, something as simple as the group you belong to, your business unit, the function you belong to, all of those bring these expectations that can be too simple. So, engineers think that marketers aren't practical enough, and marketers think engineers are too worried about numbers and don't think enough about the customers. Marketers might think we're creative and the engineers aren't. So it's these beliefs that pop to mind so quickly that can then affect things like what decisions we make about who to put on what team or how we act towards somebody else. And one of the key concepts I want to convey is that there can be truth to these beliefs, but the main psychological insight is that once we have categories in our head, the categories become too simple and too exaggerated. So I'm going to briefly share a screen with you that shows you my preferred way of thinking about this, and I think is a useful tool in general for talking about it. So when we kind of think about this idea that the categories are too simple, the main issue that can arise is that if we have a kind of in-group and an out-group, it's the marketers and the engineers, the reality on how creative they are or how number-oriented they are is that there's a lot of overlap. And even if there's some truth to the difference, it probably isn't that big. And let me state this a little bit more affirmatively. When social psychologists do research on group differences, this is the typical kind of pattern you might find between differences on many dimensions across functional categories and demographic categories. Yes, there may be some difference, but it's a small one. Now, the contrast I want to make is the following, which is that in our head, our perceptions often look more like this, that we think of there being some big difference between the typical member of the group, what I'm calling the mean here, and that the variances, to use a statistical term, kind of how compact the distributions are, well, it's more compact than the reality. And research has shown, this is especially true for outgroups, that we tend to think of the prototypical picture in our head, and we have a hard time seeing variation from it. Okay, so what I want to do then is building on this idea that we have these simple categories in our heads, also offer a few other terms. So we can think of the stereotypes then as being that quick picture that we have of others that can often be exaggerated and too simple. And also note that it's useful to distinguish those beliefs from a couple of other properties or dimensions. So one is the idea of prejudice, which is essentially a feeling that you have towards somebody as a function of the group that they belong to. And it's useful to recognize prejudices can be negative. That's how we usually mean it. But they can also be positive. We can have positive beliefs about a group, and we can then have favored feelings toward them. That is a kind of positive prejudice then. And then it's just useful to distinguish a final concept, which is discrimination, which is the behavior that we then express towards somebody as a function of their category, having beliefs about them, having feelings about them, and then acting toward them. And the reason that it's worth distinguishing these things is that we can think about, where do we want to try to change what's going on in the organization? Do we want to change beliefs? Do we want to try to change feelings? Do we want to set up practices that essentially lead behaviors to be more constructive? So it's partly the benefit of distinguishing stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination is to then think about the intervention points. Okay. One question I think that's always fair to ask about stereotypes is, if it really does look like those graphs I showed you a minute ago, with the means being exaggerated and pictures being too simple, why don't people unlearn that? Why don't people understand the complexity of the world and how much overlap there actually is between groups? And that's where another powerful concept I think is useful to have, which is just the idea of self-fulfilling prophecies. That once we start making assumptions about groups, this group is low performing. Okay, that's an assumption. It might be based on a couple of past experiences, or it might just be based on your kind of prior biases. So, but the problem is, once you have those beliefs, we tend to act on them. So who gets the good job assignments? Who gets promoted to be the temporary team leader on a team? As soon as we start making assumptions about others, we start becoming the authors of other people's futures. That we don't recognize that if we've made a very small assumption at the start, we can send them down a different path than they would have been on already. So part of the way of undoing the possibility of discrimination then is to make sure that we have ways of decoupling the actions we take toward people from those prior beliefs that we have about them. So, and it kind of practically, it could be something as simple as, when I am assembling a team, if I have prior stereotypes about a specific group, sometimes acting against your assumptions becomes the main thing that you need to do. One of the favorite examples I use in my MBA classes is I spent years at University of Chicago and now years at Fuqua. There are stereotypes about both schools. Fuqua is Team Fuqua, and we're good at leading teams. Chicago is supposedly a quant jock school, and there may be a little bit of truth to those stereotypes, but whatever the public image of those, which will sometimes show up in headlines of Business Week that I've shown my students, can often be exaggerated compared to the truth. But as soon as you have that picture of somebody in your head, you will assign the regression analysis to the Chicago person, the team leadership role to the Fuqua person, and you may never check your assumption to see, well, how good would each person be at that other activity? So that's essentially the essence of the problem with once we have these beliefs, how hard it may be to unlearn them. And then a kind of last idea I want to discuss, which I'm sure you have all heard at some point, is the basic idea of implicit biases. So this has received a lot of attention in the media over the years. And I want to give you a sense of how researchers demonstrate this and some sense of where it comes from. Now, one of the most interesting things that's happened in research over the last nearly 100 years is that if you ask people to explicitly state how they think about or feel about groups, people are much more careful and in some sense egalitarian in that they say that they see everybody as equal, which is great. But one of the problems that can arise is that what we intend to do and what we explicitly say, there can be a disconnect with what is exposed in our thinking because of just all the stuff that surrounds us in our culture. So let me illustrate this and then tell you how researchers have looked at this and have examined it. So I'll share my screen again. Oops. And here we go. Okay, so to illustrate the idea of how do researchers try to illustrate and identify the possibility of what's called an implicit bias, they build on a perception paradigm known as the Stroop Effect, which in its simplest form is demonstrated this way. So I'll ask you to play along if you wish and say the colors of the letters that I put up on my screen right now. So say the colors, green, then red, blue, red, yellow, blue, green. Okay, that is not a hard task. People are very fast at that. If, on the other hand, we now give people the following task, where they're asked to say the colors of the letters, green, red, and you can see what I've done here. These words now conflict with the color of the letters. So if blue is written in yellow, we now have these competing tendencies to, I'm supposed to say the color of the letters, which is yellow, but as soon as my mind sees the word blue, it automatically processes it, and it automatically is ready to use it, including creating the tendency to want to speak it, which then interferes with actually identifying the color correctly. So with this kind of competing tendency, the way that you do well on this task is simply by slowing down and making sure that you say the thing that you're seeing rather than the word that you're reading. All right, now this has been used in very powerful demonstrations with something called the implicit attitude test, which is having people rate different groups as a function of what category they belong to, demographic variables like young and old, black and white, male and female, and then just looking at how quickly or slowly do you associate it with other properties. So women and science. So to the extent that the culture might have stereotypes about men being more likely to be in science and better at it, we carry around those beliefs, and then we can look to see, does coupling the idea of woman and science together, is that harder than coupling men and science together? And so I'll just show you a quick screenshot of the IAT, that's the shorthand for this, where people will be given a screen. They're trying to quickly press a set of keys where they see a new image in the center of the screen, and then they have to either categorize a picture of a person who's black or white, or a word that's either good or bad. And doing all combinations of this, which I'm not going to try to explain, we can essentially see, do people seem to automatically process quickly combinations of good and European American, or are they, do they kind of treat both groups equally? And what the folks at Harvard University, who've been studying this now for a couple of decades with an online tool, what they have found is that with over 3 million people having participated in these implicit measures, they find that the vast majority of people then associate good with being white and the bad words with being black, meaning that it's just easier to kind of quickly hit a key when those words show up together on the screen, and it becomes harder to quickly identify the right kind of side of the spectrum when the words are mismatched. Just like when the word blue is written in yellow and you have to say yellow, you end up having a conflict of what you think. Okay, and so with that as a demonstration of where the idea of implicit bias is demonstrated, the kind of key insight that matters to us is that to the extent that we find over many millions of people, we have this quick automatic association of beliefs. Well, what consequence does that have for organizations? And where does it, for one thing, where does it come from? And as I mentioned earlier, people don't explicitly endorse stereotypes, although interestingly, if you ask them, what do you think other people think the stereotypes are? They tend to be able to name them easily. And that's maybe the simplest way to think about where the implicit bias comes from. It's because it's already floating in the culture, which means it's inside our head because of the images we see on TV. stories we heard as kids, whatever it is, it's already in there ready to kind of pop out if we are under the kind of time pressure that I was describing in the implicit attitude test studies, which then I think points to some situations in which we have to worry about these kind of implicit measures. When do they matter? And one way of thinking about it is, with our good intentions, we can often try to become self-aware and avoid biases. But if we are distracted or tired or overwhelmed with information or under time pressure, those are all the kinds of situations where we then have our guard down and we have to kind of worry about good processes that protect us against having these kinds of things leak through. So I'll be clear, there's lots of research showing that without these additional resources to control our reactions, we have to worry about implicit biases slipping through at that point. One other place where it can slip through that will be relevant is like our very first impression and how we act towards somebody. So one of the kind of main issues in some of the current questions around police work is the value of de-escalation as a tool and the problem of kind of the first beginning of an interaction and how that plays out. So I'll return to that shortly. As I finish up on the implicit bias, though, I want to note that there's been some interesting research showing that simply talking about implicit bias can itself have some negative consequences. For one thing, it kind of makes people aware of the stereotypes, which further reinforces this cultural thing. But the other is that it can make them seem more normal, because once we see that everybody else does it, then it seems like, well, and once again, I'm not sure this is conscious, but unconsciously, it just seems more normal. And I think my main lesson in that is not to say we shouldn't be sharing this research I just did with you, but that it's not enough to know about it. It's not enough to know about it because that isn't enough to help us then deal effectively with the kinds of problems it can create. All right, so what I want to finish up with are some examples of practices and some motivation for those practices. And I'm going to make a bit of a connection then to my main area of research, which is on decision-making research. About 10 years ago, Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, wrote a book, a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list, called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he argued that we have lots of fast automatic processes. So in the world of decision-making, it's like getting stuck on a number or being afraid of losses and not wanting to change, or being influenced by current emotions. But that we can undo these kind of fast ways of thinking with slower ways, where we do try to use more data and we try to be more complete and balanced in our thinking. And the main insight I think that comes out of this decision-making research is that it's not enough to know about biases. You have to have steps and practices that allow you to mitigate them, to counter them, to avoid them. And in the field of behavioral economics, this has become known as nudges. So one of the best examples of a nudge that takes advantage of the fact that we don't change easily and we don't like the loss of having to go from one thing to another is the very fact that defaults in decision making are very powerful. And what I mean by that is kind of where you start is where you tend to stay. So research has been done showing that our tendency to be organ donors matters a lot. It matters whether we have to opt into being an organ donor, which is very common in the US, or we automatically start in there and then we have the free choice to opt out. Well, it turns out that opting in versus out accounts for about a 70% swing across European countries that start in those two different places. And firms have adopted this insight to recognize if we want our employees to be invested in their retirement savings, we should make sure that we start them in it instead of having them have to kind of have the knowledge and make the heroic steps it takes to get the paperwork done. So start them in it, they'll tend to stay in it. And in fact, empirically, this makes a huge difference, especially for those lower on the income spectrum. This is actually a very helpful nudge for them. So the same idea, I think, applies for certain diversity issues, and I'll quickly illustrate this with two basic ideas. So one is the idea of blinding, which is in the evaluation process, if we think people might have prior beliefs about a member of that group, an engineer, an African-American, a woman, is there a way then to have them evaluate the quality of the work separate from any prior beliefs they have about that category? And one of the most powerful ideas that has been receiving a lot of attention is the idea of blinding. And what I mean by that is you get to see the work, but you don't know who the source is. And for our many alumni who I hope are watching, when I grade our MBA students on their exams, I'm a big believer in not knowing the name of the student as I'm grading. And in fact, to the extent that there are different parts of the exam, like an open-ended essay part and a multiple choice part, I don't want to know their score on the multiple choice when I'm grading the essay. And the reason is I want the words to speak for themselves, and I don't want any prior expectation about who that person is or how well they've been performing to influence how reading what is often an ambiguous set of words, what is the quality of that thing. So the basic idea is that there's a time and place in organizations to try to be blind. You can do it during the hiring process. You can do it during an evaluation process. And one of the classic stories that illustrates this is the idea of when someone tries out in an orchestra, if you're one of the heads of the orchestra, do you see them as they perform, or do you just hear the music? And I think the assumption is we want the best musician, which means it's the quality of the music that matters. So historically, if people had prior beliefs that certain people are better at playing the violin than others, the problem is that their prior belief can leak into and affect how they hear the music. I mean, literally, they will hear it differently. A mistake made by a person from one group versus another will be held against the person in one case and not the other. And so the interesting and powerful solution to that is have people try out for orchestras behind a screen so that the listeners literally are blind to who's playing, but they can hear the music and judge the music in its own right. Okay, and then the last thing I want to mention is this idea of the value of thinking through de-escalation in the context of the topics that have been making the news lately, which is there's empirical work showing that in that first few seconds of interacting with someone that you've pulled over, a policeman will act differently towards someone who's African American than someone who's white. And that can lead to the self-fulfilling processes that I mentioned. And it also means that one of the main things that we can also do is, as we have kind of any prior expectations that lead us to be more aggressive or more fearful, we want to then have the habits to help us know how do we keep initial concerns, initial actions from spiraling upward. And so I think one of the most powerful things that has been empirically validated is the value of being trained in de-escalation. And I just want to contrast that with the idea of training people in implicit bias. I think knowing the biases exist is useful and perhaps motivating to take additional steps, but simply knowing about the biases isn't enough to undo them. The beauty of the de-escalation training is it gives you concrete actions you're supposed to take at each point to keep fears or aggression from getting worse and trying to rein them in. All right, so I think I'm going to stop there. I know I've got a few questions, and I'm going to pull my screen up with those questions, and let me see what questions you all might have offered. So one of the questions is on the implicit bias, can we determine what our biases are, and can anyone take the test from Harvard? And in fact, yes, you can. So I quickly on one of the screens earlier put up the URL for the implicit bias website. I think we can post it in the comments or somewhere underneath this video as well. So if you just look up Project Implicit, you will find their website. You can then sign up to take some of these tests, and they have an amazing number of them. So they have age, they've got various race and gender categories, they've got sexual orientation, and one of the other things that this research has allowed them to do is look at, do different groups express different levels of bias? And for me, one of the most powerful things that they've uncovered is that the US has a strong age bias. And I think we see it in commercials. Older people, there's certain products sold to them. It does kind of imply a decline in health. Or you need this medicine to keep you from declining in health. anyway, all of these things there's a kind of celebration in the American culture of the vigor of youth and this focus on the decline in age, rather than, for example, other cultures focusing more on the wisdom of being older. So anyway, in the IAT studies at Harvard, they show a strong preference for younger people. That's automatic. We associate young and good. We associate old and bad in that rapid way that I showed you earlier. And it's true of both young and old people having those associations. And so this, once again, I think illustrates that it's not just who I am being biased towards somebody who I'm not, but it's that the culture gives us these associations that lead us to automatically associate youth with vigor, and that's a positive thing in this culture. So yes, I encourage you to go to the Harvard site, try a few of these. They're quick, and you can then, after you've done them, see what the distribution of outcomes looks like across these many different categories. This may also be a useful tool at work if you wanted to spur a conversation, but as I've already warned, I think this could be the beginning of a conversation, but I think simply recognizing biases isn't enough to then take the positive actions that will be helpful. Let me take a look at a few other questions here. So one question is, what are some leadership lessons that could come from knowing more about research? And for me, one of the key insights is recognizing these dangers of self-fulfilling prophecies, that to be efficient in work, we often want to just put the best person on the job. And that best person for the job is often somebody who we have had a little bit of experience with, but maybe not a lot. And in those cases, prior beliefs about people from that group could end up being a strong determinant of the choices that we make. And out of efficiency, maybe that is the right answer most of the time. But I think the main thing I would ask leaders to consider is, if one of our goals is to develop people, sometimes we have to work against our assumptions to give them opportunities and the resources to succeed, so that if we think somebody is good at numbers but not with people, experiment on the margin at low cost to give them some people opportunities. For one thing, you could discover that you're wrong and they actually are good. The other is that you could help them build those skills. So I think the danger, I think, is once we have these prior categories, it can lock us into these paths where we don't end up letting other people develop new skills and broaden themselves. Okay, and I think we're approaching the end of our time. So I want to thank you for being with us today. I will also remind you that over the course of the next few days through Thursday, that we will have more sessions on race and justice and fairness on LinkedIn. And I will also let you know that my colleague Ronnie Chatterjee will be talking about CEO activism and race tomorrow. This is an area where he's done a lot of research and he will bring us a lot of expertise. So thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.